The last roses of Ashworth Abbey clung stubbornly to the cloister walls, their crimson a defiant blush against the mellowing gold of the late October sun. A chill wind, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth from the Yorkshire moors, whispered through the ancient arches, rustling the parchment leaves of the great ledger Abbess Agnes was attempting to reconcile. It was the year of our Lord 1538, and the air itself, heavy with the turning of the season, seemed to hold its breath, waiting. For centuries Ashworth had stood, a beacon of prayer and learning nestled in the curve of the River Ash, its stones worn smooth by time and the elements. Its reputation for piety and good order was widespread, its scriptorium famed for the beauty of its illuminated manuscripts. Agnes, abbess for a decade, felt the profound weight of those centuries in the very marrow of her bones, in the set of her shoulders as she bent over her accounts, in the slight, persistent ache behind her keen gray eyes. She was a woman of 42 years, tall and carrying her slender frame with a quiet grace that commanded attention more effectively than any overt display of authority. Her wimple, stark white against the dark wool of her habit, framed a face of thoughtful composure, lined more by contemplation and the cares of her office than by age. Her hands, elegant but strong, were now clasped in her lap. A brief respite from the meticulous task of ensuring the Abbey's finances were, as always, beyond reproach. The rhythmic chant of the nuns at Sext had faded an hour past, the sacred melodies absorbed into the ancient stones. Now, the softer, more mundane sounds of the Abbey at work permeated the chill air, the distant, rhythmic clatter from the kitchens where Sister Martha supervised the baking of the day's bread. The contented hum of the spinning wheels in the west wing where the older nuns carded and spun wool from Ashworth's own sheep, the almost inaudible scratch of Sister Cecily's quill in the scriptorium as she painstakingly applied gold leaf to the initial letter of a psalter. These were the sounds of continuity, of a life ordered by the chiming of bells and the immutable cycle of the seasons. Yet, beneath this surface of serene industry, a current of profound disquiet had begun to flow, mirroring the troubled spiritual waters of the kingdom itself. King Henry, once styled defender of the faith by a grateful pope, now, by his own decree and that of a compliant parliament, styled himself supreme head of the Church in England. His long, bitter quarrel with Rome, born of dynastic ambition and a king's unbridled will, had become a violent tearing of the very fabric of spiritual life in the land. Word, like a contagion borne on the wind, had spread from the south, tales of lesser monasteries suppressed, their communities dispersed, their lands and treasures seized for the king's ever-empty coffers. Each rumor that reached the relative seclusion of Ashworth, carried by traveling merchants seeking shelter, or by anxious pilgrims on their way to the diminished shrines of the north, tightened the knot of apprehension in Agnes's stomach. So far, the great abbeys, particularly those in the traditionally more steadfast north, like Ashworth, had remained largely untouched. Their ancient charters, considerable landholdings, and perceived influence a seeming bulwark. But Agnes was no fool. She knew that such bulwarks could be eroded, or battered down, by a determined monarch. For how long could Ashworth hope to remain an island of tranquility in such a turbulent sea? Agnes dipped her quill into the inkpot, the dark, iron gall liquid mirroring the foreboding that had settled in her heart. The ledger before her, its vellum pages filled with her neat, precise script, detailing the Abbey's modest but well-managed estates, its rents from tenant farmers, its tithes from the local parishes, its carefully recorded alms to the poor of the district, was a testament to prudent stewardship, to a community that lived not in idleness or luxury, but in productive piety. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the draughts that snaked through the ancient chapter house, that such virtues would count for little against the king's rapacious appetite and the cold, calculating zeal of his vicar general, Thomas Cromwell. A discreet cough, so soft it was almost lost in the sigh of the wind, broke her reverie. Sister Eleanor, the sub-prioress, stood in the arched doorway, her hands folded within her wide sleeves. Her expression carefully, almost unnaturally, neutral. Eleanor, a woman some 15 years Agnes's senior, whose pragmatism was as sturdy and unyielding as her ample frame, had been Agnes's confidant and, at times, her most challenging counselor. For many years. Her wisdom was born of long experience, her loyalty to Ashworth and its abbess unquestionable. "Reverend Mother," Eleanor began, her voice low, pitched to carry no further than Agnes's ears, "a rider has been sighted on the old London road, making good speed towards the Abbey gates. He bears the livery of a king's messenger." Agnes set down her quill. The ink formed a small, dark pool on the tip, like a single black tear. She met Eleanor's gaze, her own steady, betraying none of the sudden coldness that clutched at her heart. "Then let us not keep him waiting, sister. The king's business, whatever it may be, must be attended to with all due respect." She rose, smoothing the simple dark wool of her Benedictine habit. Outside the tall, arched window of the chapter house, the last rose, buffeted by a sudden, sharp gust, shed a single perfect petal onto the stone sill. It lay there, a poignant speck of dying crimson in the encroaching gray of the afternoon. The symbolism was not lost on her. The messenger, a wiry, hard-bitten man whose travel-stained clothes and mud-spattered boots spoke of long, hard riding, bowed curtly, his eyes darting about the austere but well-kept reception room as if already cataloguing its potential worth for his masters. He presented the sealed parchment with a brusque flourish that seemed ill-suited to its solemn import. Agnes accepted it, her fingers, remarkably, steady as she broke the heavy wax seal bearing the king's insignia. The language of the document was formal, couched in the elaborate, deferential courtesies of the royal court, but its underlying message was stark, unyielding. His Majesty's commissioners, among them a certain Master Richard Thorne, would arrive within the week to conduct a full and thorough visitation of Ashworth Abbey. They were charged, the document stated, to inquire into its governance, its adherence to the true faith as now defined by the King's most sacred majesty, and the current state of its temporal and spiritual affairs. Agnes read it through twice, the florid Latin phrases, each one weighted with unspoken threat, imprinting themselves on her mind. This was no mere routine inquiry. No benign episcopal visit. This was the beginning of the end, unless a miracle intervened. "You may inform your masters that Ashworth Abbey will be prepared to receive the King's commissioners," she said, her voice cool and even, betraying none of the turmoil that churned within her breast. "John Fletcher, our steward, will see to your refreshment before you depart. The roads are hard, and you have ridden far." When the messenger, visibly relieved to have discharged his duty and eager for the promised ale and bread, had been escorted from the room by a grave-faced Fletcher, Sister Eleanor finally spoke, her usual robust pragmatism edged with a rare and palpable anxiety. "Richard Thorne, Agnes. I have heard that name whispered in the market town, and not with any fondness. They say he is Cromwell's man, sharp as a new blade and twice as cold. He has a reputation for thoroughness." She paused, her gaze meeting Agnes's directly. "And for finding precisely what he is. Sent to find, whether it is there in truth or not." Agnes walked to the narrow window, her back to Eleanor, looking out at the cloister garth where the last of the season's medicinal herbs were being carefully gathered by Sister Perpetua, the aged infirmarian. The scent of bruised lavender and thyme drifted faintly on the air. "Then we must ensure he finds nothing but truth and piety here, Eleanor," Agnes said, her voice softer now, almost weary. "And we must pray that, in these dark and shifting times, those are still virtues the King's men recognize, or are permitted to recognize." But even as she spoke the words, a cold certainty settled in her heart, heavy as a millstone. Prayer alone would not save Ashworth. The storm, long dreaded, had finally reached their gates. The days that followed were a strange, disquieting blend of heightened spiritual activity and frantic, almost furtive, temporal preparations. Agnes convened the chapter, the entire community of nearly 30 nuns gathered in the ancient, timber-roofed hall. The air was thick with unspoken fear. She read the king's letter aloud. Her voice deliberately calm and even, though she felt every eye in the room fixed upon her, searching her face for a reassurance she found it increasingly difficult to offer. Sister Cecily, young and barely out of her novitiate, her face as pale as the new vellum she worked upon in the scriptorium, clutched the small wooden cross at her belt as if it were a lifeline. Old Sister Perpetua. Deaf and rheumy-eyed, her mind often wandering back to a childhood lived before any of them were born, hummed a tuneless snatch of a Marian hymn, blessedly oblivious to the immediate peril. Others exchanged nervous glances, their usual conventual composure visibly frayed. Sister Mary Magdalene, a woman whose worldly past at a minor noble court sometimes resurfaced in moments of stress through a certain impatient tapping of her foot or a sharp turn of phrase, looked more defiant than afraid. "We will receive the king's men with the courtesy and respect due to their office," Agnes stated, her gaze sweeping slowly across their faces, meeting each nun's eyes in turn. "We will answer their questions truthfully and fully. We have nothing to hide. Ashworth has ever been a house of God, faithful to his holy word and, until these recent troubles, loyal to the crown." A small, hesitant murmur of assent rippled through the assembled sisters, though it lacked the robust conviction of their usual responses. "Let us prepare ourselves, first and foremost, with prayer," Agnes continued, her voice gaining strength. "Let us rededicate ourselves to our vows. Let us also ensure that the Abbey is immaculate in every corner, our records and accounts in perfect order, our sacred duties performed with even greater diligence than usual. Let their visitation find us as we always are, humble servants of Christ, living according to the holy rule of Saint Benedict." In the privacy of her own sparse, stone-floored chamber, however, Agnes's prayers were more troubled, more desperate. She knelt for long hours before the simple wooden crucifix on the wall, the very same that had belonged to Abbess Ejiofor, Ashworth's revered founder 4 centuries prior. "Domini, Deus meus," she whispered into the cold, unresponsive air, the Latin of her heart's cry more natural to her than her native English in such moments of profound supplication. "Grant me wisdom beyond my understanding, grant me strength beyond my own meager reserves. Show me the path through this encroaching darkness. How best to shepherd this flock you have entrusted to my unworthy care." But the silence in the small room offered no easy answers, only the echo of her own anxieties. Her mind, trained in the rigorous logic of scholastic theology and the practicalities of managing a large and complex estate, wrestled with the implications of the impending visitation. If Master Thorne was indeed as ruthless and predetermined in his objectives as Eleanor suggested, then truth and piety, however genuine, might easily be twisted into accusations of stubborn superstition, of adherence to popish ways now deemed treasonous. The Abbey's modest wealth, so carefully managed over generations to support its community, its charitable works for the local poor, its renowned scriptorium, all this could be portrayed by a malevolent inquisitor as hoarded riches, ill-gotten gains ripe for the king's plucking. She spent many long hours with John Fletcher, the Abbey's steward, a man whose loyalty was as gnarled and steadfast as the ancient oaks that lined the banks of the River Ash. Fletcher, his weathered face a roadmap of 60 years lived in devoted service to Ashworth, understood the ways of the secular world, its deceits and its dangers far better than most within the cloister's protective embrace. "Reverend Mother," he said, his voice heavy with foreboding, as they reviewed the estate ledgers for the 10th time in as many days, the meticulously kept accounts a testament to Ashworth's honest dealings. "These men. They are not like the bishop's clerks on their biennial visitations, content with a good meal, a flagon of our best ale, and a cursory glance at the books. They come with a purpose, a charge from Master Cromwell himself, and Master Cromwell, as all England now knows, does not send men like this Richard Thorne on idle errands. I know it, John. I know it too well, Agnes replied, her finger tracing the neat columns of figures detailing rents received and alms disbursed. Our lands are fertile. Some of the best in this riding. Our wools command a good price in York, and even as far as Calais. There are those at court, land-hungry men, who would look upon Ashworth's holdings with covetous eyes, whispering poison into the king's ear. Aye, that they would, Fletcher nodded, his brow furrowed. And the king himself has a bottomless need for coin, what with his new wars in France, his grand palaces. And his many wives. He hesitated, then lowered his voice further, though they were alone in Agnes's small study. There are whispers, Reverend Mother, carried on the wind from those houses already surrendered, that some have found favor, or at least a slightly less brutal dissolution, by offering substantial gifts to the crown, or, more discreetly, to Master Cromwell and his agents. Agnes's lips thinned, a line of distaste etching itself around her mouth. A bribe, John, you counsel me to purchase our own survival with the very patrimony we are sworn to protect for God's service and the welfare of the poor. The thought was repugnant, a betrayal of every principle she held dear. Yet, the welfare of her nuns, the continuation of their life of prayer, the preservation of some small part of Ashworth's legacy. What price was too high, or, more to the point, what price was low enough to be considered, yet high enough to be effective? This was a question that would torment her in the sleepless watches of the nights to come. She also met frequently with Sister Eleanor, their discussions often lasting late into the night, the only light in Agnes's austere chamber the flickering, sputtering flame of a single tallow candle, its scent mingling with the faint aroma of beeswax from the polished wooden crucifix. Eleanor, ever practical, her mind focused on the tangible realities, urged a different kind of caution. Agnes, we must be prepared for the worst. Not just spiritually, though God knows our prayers have never been more fervent, but materially. If the unthinkable happens. If Ashworth is to be dissolved. What of the older sisters? Sister Perpetua is nearly 80 and frail. Sister Bridget has the lung fever again. What of the sick, the infirm? Where would they go? Their families, if they still have any, are long distant, or too poor to take them in. They would die on the roads. Agnes. The king's letter speaks only of an inquiry, Eleanor, a visitation to ensure good order, not a suppression, Agnes reminded her, though her own conviction in those words wavered with each passing day, each fresh rumor of another religious house fallen. The king's letters, Reverend Mother, are penned by clever, ambitious men who know well the value of soft words before the hard, inevitable blow, Eleanor retorted, her voice uncharacteristically sharp, touched with a rare exasperation. Look to Fountains, to Rievaulx, to our Benedictine brothers at Selby. Great houses, ancient and proud. Brought low, their communities scattered to the winds. We must think of the nuns, Agnes. Not the cold stone and mortar of these walls, however hallowed. Not even the gold plate on the high altar, or the jewels in the reliquaries, but the women. Their lives. Their souls. Her passionate words, so unlike Eleanor's usual measured tones, struck a chord deep within Agnes. For all her profound love of Ashworth's ancient stones, its echoing silence is pregnant with centuries of prayer, its hallowed traditions, its magnificent library of precious books and manuscripts. It was the living community of souls within its walls, the 30 women who looked to her for guidance and protection, that formed her truest, most sacred charge. And so, as the days shortened perceptibly and the autumn winds grew colder, stripping the last leaves from the great elms along the riverbank, a subtle but significant shift occurred within the cloistered walls of Ashworth. Prayers were said with a new, almost desperate fervor, the ancient chants imbued with a raw, poignant beauty. But alongside them, quieter, more furtive preparations began to take shape. Under Agnes's reluctant but resolute direction, Sister Eleanor and John Fletcher initiated a discreet, highly confidential inventory of the abbey's most sacred and irreplaceable portable treasures, the oldest illuminated manuscripts from the scriptorium, including the famed Ashworth Psalter with its exquisite Celtic knotwork. The heavy silver gilt chalices used only on the highest feast days, the intricately carved ivory crozier of Abbess Ejiofor. The jeweled reliquary said to contain a fragment of St. Hilda's bone, a relic that drew pilgrims from across the Riding. Not with the intent of outright defiance, Agnes told herself, trying to reconcile these actions with her vows of obedience, but of prudent safeguarding. A temporary measure. Merely to protect these holy things from potential sacrilege or careless handling by worldly men, just in case the worst, indeed, came to pass. The day Master Richard Thorne and his retinue were due to arrive, a nervous, almost suffocating hush fell over Ashworth. Even the birds in the cloister garth seemed to have muted their usually cheerful song. The kitchen fires smoked sullenly, the wind being from the east. Agnes waited in the gatehouse, the traditional place for an abbess to receive important visitors, Sister Eleanor at her side, a silent, reassuring presence. Agnes had dressed with meticulous care in her best, though still austerely simple, black habit. Her abbess's ring. A plain, unadorned band of beaten silver set with a single, deep purple amethyst, a symbol of her office and her spiritual marriage to Christ and His Church, felt unusually heavy. Almost a manacle, on her finger. The clatter of hooves on the cobblestones outside the main gate, sharp and intrusive in the expectant stillness, announced their arrival. Several men, armed and wearing the king's livery, rode in first, their expressions hard and indifferent. They were followed by a harried-looking clerk, his saddlebags bulging with books, inkhorns, and rolls of parchment. And then, riding a fine black gelding with an air of confident authority, came Master Richard Thorne himself. He dismounted with a fluid, almost predatory grace, tossing his reins to one of his men. He was younger than Agnes had pictured from Eleanor's descriptions, perhaps in his mid-30s, and dressed not in the somber robes of a churchman, but in dark, well-cut secular clothes of fine wool that spoke of London tailoring rather than the rougher styles of the provinces. His face was lean, intelligent, his features sharp, almost ascetic, were it not for the worldly calculation in his pale, assessing grey eyes, eyes that seemed to miss nothing, to catalogue and evaluate everything they rested upon. A thin, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips as his gaze met Agnes's, a smile that did not, by any measure, reach his eyes. "Reverend Mother Agnes of Ashworth," he inquired, his voice smooth, cultured, but with an underlying edge of tempered steel, "I am Richard Thorne, sent on the king's behalf. I trust our arrival was not entirely unexpected." Agnes inclined her head, a gesture of formal courtesy, her own voice, when she spoke, remarkably calm, betraying none of the sudden, icy dread that had taken root in her soul. "Master Thorne, Ashworth Abbey bids you welcome, such as it is. We are, as always, at the king's service, and ready to assist His Majesty's commissioners in their inquiries." The siege of Ashworth, unspoken but undeniable, had begun. Thorne established his presence, and his authority, with swift and uncompromising efficiency. He commandeered the abbey's modest guest house for himself and his senior clerk, a sour-faced man named Riotously, who seemed to view the nuns with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. His half-dozen armed men, rough soldiers more accustomed to the battlefield than the cloister, were billeted, to Agnes's quiet but profound dismay, in the lay brothers' vacant dormitory, a building uncomfortably close to the nuns' own sleeping quarters in the main abbey complex. Their presence was an immediate and jarring disruption to the peace and order of the community. His first official act, within an hour of his arrival, was to summon Abbess Agnes and Sister Eleanor, as sub-prioress, to the chapter house. This ancient hall, with its vaulted stone roof and worn stone benches where generations of Ashworth nuns had gathered for counsel and governance, he had summarily designated as his makeshift office. He sat behind the great oak table where Agnes herself usually presided over chapter meetings, a subtle but deliberate usurpation of her authority that was not lost on either of the women. His clerk, riotously, a weedy young man with perpetually ink-stained fingers and a nervous cough, busily sharpened quills at a smaller side table, his eyes darting furtively between Thorn and the two black-robed nuns. "Reverend Mother," Thorn began, his fingers drumming a light, impatient tattoo on the polished, age-darkened wood of the table, "His Majesty, the King, desires only to ensure that all religious houses within his realm, such as this Abbey of Ashworth, are well ordered. That their considerable wealth, granted for pious purposes, is indeed put to such use, and not squandered in idleness or luxury. And, most importantly, that no superstitious or papistical practices persist, contrary to God's true law and His Majesty's most wise and sacred injunctions. Ashworth Abbey has always striven to be a house of good order and sincere piety." "Master Thorn," Agnes replied, her hands clasped loosely in her lap, her voice betraying no hint of the apprehension that tightened her chest. "Our accounts are, and have always been, open for your inspection. Our lives are lived according to the holy rule of Saint Benedict, in prayer, work, and charity." "So you say, Reverend Mother." "So you say." Thorn's thin, almost reptilian smile reappeared for a fleeting moment. "But the rule of Saint Benedict, as I recall from my studies at Cambridge, speaks much of poverty, chastity, and obedience. We shall see, in the course of our inquiry, how well Ashworth exemplifies these foundational virtues." His gaze flickered dismissively over the ancient, faded tapestries depicting scenes from the life of Saint Benedict that adorned the chapter house walls, then towards the intricately carved misericords of the choir stalls visible through the open doorway leading to the church. Some religious houses, it has been found, have interpreted the vow of poverty rather broadly. Their abbots and abbesses live like princes, while the poor starve at their gates. The inquiry began in earnest the following morning, a cold, grey day with a persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into the very stones of the abbey, mirroring the gloom that had settled upon its inhabitants. Thorn, proving true to his reputation, was methodical, relentless, and utterly without sentiment. He started with the physical fabric of the abbey itself. He paced the length and breadth of the great Norman church, his booted feet echoing unnervingly on the ancient flagstones that covered the graves of former abbesses. He scrutinized the high altar, the side chapels, the statues of saints, many of them gifts from noble patrons centuries ago, and the magnificent stained glass windows depicting scenes from the lives of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and various northern saints. He made copious notes in a leather-bound book, his expression unreadable, his comments few but pointed. "This statue of the Blessed Virgin," he said, stopping before a particularly fine medieval carving of Mary holding the Christ child, its original vibrant paint and gilding still remarkably preserved. "Is it an object of particular or excessive veneration? Reverend Mother, do your nuns, perchance, offer prayers to this image, rather than through it to God Almighty, as the King's injunctions now strictly command?" "We honor the Mother of our Lord, as is fitting and proper, Master Thorn," Agnes said carefully, choosing her words with precision. "Our prayers, however, are directed to God alone, through the intercession of His saints, as the Church has always taught." Thorn tapped the statue's serene, painted face with a dismissive fingernail. The sound was like a small sacrilege in the hallowed space. "Gaudy, I should say. And dangerously close to idolatry. The King's new injunctions are quite clear, and rigorously enforced, on such matters of potential spiritual error. Then came the individual interviews with the nuns. One by one, they were summoned to the chapter house, to face Master Thorn alone, save for the silent, note-taking riotously. Agnes had counseled them beforehand to be truthful, calm, and courteous, to answer directly what was asked, and to volunteer nothing more. But she knew that fear, especially in the younger or more timid sisters, could make even the most steadfast tongue falter, could lead to confused or incriminating replies under the pressure of Thorn's sharp, insinuating questions. Sister Cecily emerged from her interview, which lasted nearly an hour, pale and trembling, tears silently tracing paths down her young, usually cheerful cheeks. Agnes found her later in the scriptorium, her usually deft fingers fumbling with her brushes, a smear of expensive ultramarine pigment marring the otherwise perfect vellum page of the psalter she was working on. The image of King David, harp in hand, now seemed to weep blue tears. "What did he ask you, child?" Agnes asked gently, placing a comforting hand on the young nun's shoulder, feeling the tremors that ran through her slight frame. He asked if we believed the abbess had special powers, or holiness beyond other women, Cecily whispered, her voice catching on a sob. "If you could perform miracles. If the water you blessed in the font was holier than any other spring water." He asked about the old reliquary, the one with St. Hilda's bone. If we truly believed it could cure sickness, or ward off evil spirits. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and bewilderment, met Agnes's. He asked if we made offerings to it, or kissed it with undue reverence. Agnes felt a distinct chill. These were not random inquiries. These were leading questions, cleverly designed to elicit responses that could be twisted into accusations of witchcraft, fraud, or the encouragement of forbidden superstitious practices. "And what did you tell him, Cecily, my dear?" Agnes kept her voice soft, reassuring. I told him you were a good and holy woman, Reverend Mother, who taught us only what was in the Gospels and the rule. And that all healing, all miracles, come from God alone, though he may choose to work through his saints or his chosen servants." Agnes squeezed her shoulder gently. "You answered well, child. Very well indeed. You spoke the truth, and with courage." But the encounter left her deeply uneasy. Thorn was not just looking for financial mismanagement or lax discipline. He was actively hunting for heresy, for anything, however flimsy, that could be used to condemn them and justify the abbey's seizure. As the days, each one longer and more fraught than the last, wore on, Thorn's inquiries delved deeper, his net spreading wider. He riotously scrutinized the abbey's extensive accounts, questioning every expenditure, from the regular purchase of vellum and pigments for the renowned scriptorium to the alms given to the local poor, even the cost of rushes for the dormitory floors. John Fletcher, summoned frequently to explain items from decades past, bore the brunt of these relentless financial interrogations, his weathered face growing more lined and his patience wearing visibly thin under Thorn's constant insinuations of incompetence, profligacy, or deliberate concealment of income. "This recurrent expenditure on wine, Master Steward," Thorn would say, his finger stabbing at an entry in the thick ledger. "A rather large quantity, year upon year. For a community of supposedly abstemious women, would not you agree? Or is it perhaps used for less spiritual purposes, private entertainments, perhaps? It is sacramental wine, sir, for the daily mass and for communion," Fletcher would grit out, his face flushed with suppressed anger. "And wine for the sick in the infirmary, as prescribed by our infirmarian according to ancient practice. And, yes, a small, measured allowance for the high table on the great feast days of the Church, as is the tradition in all well-regulated houses, and as permitted by our rule." Tradition, Thorn would echo, drawing out the word with a sneer. "Many traditions, Master Fletcher, are proving to be inconvenient. to the king's necessary and godly reforms. And costly to his majesty's treasury, it would seem. Abbess Agnes, meanwhile, found herself locked in a subtle, ongoing battle of wits and wills with the commissioner. He would summon her without warning, at all hours, questioning her on obscure points of scholastic theology, on her precise interpretation of the king's latest religious injunctions, on the history of Ashworth's endowments and landholdings, probing for any inconsistency, any hint of dissent or disloyalty. She answered carefully, her mind sharp and agile, drawing on her extensive education in Latin, Scripture, and canon law, and on her years of leadership. She refused to be intimidated, meeting his cold, unwavering gaze with her own steady, direct one. She would not allow him to see her fear, or her growing despair. "You are an educated woman, Abbess," Thorn remarked one afternoon, after a particularly rigorous interrogation about the contents of the Abbey's library and whether it contained any books by heretical authors such as Luther, Tyndale, or even the more subtly dangerous Erasmus. "Unusually so, if I may say, for your sex, and for one committed to the cloistered life." There was a faint, almost imperceptible sneer in his tone, a hint of the common prejudice that deemed learning in women unnatural, or even dangerous. The rule of Saint Benedict, Master Thorn, encourages sacred learning, Lectio Divina, for all its adherents, men and women alike, Agnes replied calmly, her voice even. "Wisdom, and the pursuit of divine truth, are not, I believe, the sole or exclusive province of men." A flicker of something, annoyance, grudging respect, perhaps even surprise, crossed Thorn's usually impassive features, but was quickly gone, replaced by his customary cold mask. "Wisdom, Abbess," he retorted smoothly, "also lies in recognizing the prevailing wind of change, and adjusting one's sails accordingly, lest the entire vessel be wrecked upon the rocks of obstinacy." The pressure, subtle and overt, was relentless, unceasing. Thorn's men, growing bored and resentful of the austere, restricted Abbey life, became more openly disruptive. Their loud laughter, their coarse jests and snatches of bawdy song, echoed in the usually silent, sacred cloisters, a constant, jarring intrusion. They demanded better food than the simple convent fare, more ale, and complained loudly about the lack of female company. One, bolder or drunker than the rest, was caught trying to accost a young kitchen maid in the buttery. Agnes, her face pale with fury, protested vehemently to Thorn about the lack of discipline among his men and the violation of the Abbey's sanctuary. Thorn merely shrugged, a gesture of calculated indifference. "They are soldiers, Abbess, not monks or choirboys. Men of the world, with worldly appetites. Perhaps if your community offered a more welcoming and less rigidly controlled atmosphere, such unfortunate incidents might be avoided." The insinuation was vile, unmistakable, and Agnes felt a surge of cold, righteous anger, though she managed, with immense effort, to keep her voice level. "My community, Master Thorn, offers prayer, charity, and a life dedicated to God. It is not, nor will it ever be, a place for licentiousness or indiscipline. I expect your men to respect the sanctity of this house, as your commission demands you do." Thorn merely smiled his thin, cold smile. "Your expectations, Abbess, may prove to be unrealistic." Internally, the carefully ordered life of the Abbey was beginning to show serious signs of strain. Sister Mary Magdalene, she of the worldly past, was heard muttering more frequently that perhaps a quiet pension from the king and a return to the secular world, however diminished, would not be so terrible a fate after all. Some of the younger nuns, like Cecily, grew increasingly fearful and wept easily, starting at every unexpected sound. Even Sister Eleanor's robust pragmatism was being sorely tested. Her face seemed grayer, more lined, with each passing day. "Agnes," she said one evening, her voice heavy with a weary sortie of dread, as they sat in Agnes's small, cold chamber, the single candle casting long, wavering shadows on the stone walls. "He means to break us. He will not leave Ashworth, I feel it in my bones, until he has found what he needs, or fabricated what he needs, to condemn this house." "And what if there is nothing of substance to find, Eleanor?" Agnes asked, though the question felt hollow even to her own ears. "What if our lives are, as we believe them to be, truly lived in accordance with our rule and God's law?" Eleanor sighed, a sound like the wind escaping from a cracked wineskin. "Then, my dear Agnes, he will invent it. Or he will make our lives, and the lives of every sister here, so unbearable that we will sign anything, agree to anything, just to see the back of him and his swaggering bullies." She looked at Agnes, her usually sharp eyes troubled, almost pleading. Perhaps we should seriously consider what gifts might appease him. John Fletcher still believes he knows men at court, intermediaries, who could discreetly smooth the path. For a price. Agnes rose and began to pace the confines of the small room, her black robes whispering against the cold stone floor. The idea of bribery, of stooping to such sordid, worldly means, was still abhorrent to her deepest convictions. It felt like a betrayal of everything Ashworth stood for. Yet, Eleanor's desperate words about the welfare of the nuns, the grim future they faced if the abbey were to be violently suppressed, resonated with a terrible, undeniable force. What was her primary duty now? To uphold the letter of the law, the abstract purity of her vows, even if it meant the destruction of everything and the almost certain suffering of her entire community, or to bend, to compromise. To engage, however distastefully, in the sordid games of the world in order to save what tangible good she could. "Not yet, Eleanor," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let us not stoop to their level. Not yet. There may still be other ways. We must exhaust all honorable paths first." The other ways, however, involved an escalation of their own clandestine, and deeply perilous, efforts. Under the blessed cover of moonless nights, aided by the silent, ever-loyal John Fletcher, whose knowledge of the Abbey's labyrinthine passages and forgotten corners was unparalleled, Abbess Agnes and Sister Eleanor began to move more of Ashworth's irreplaceable treasures, not just the easily portable items like chalices and small reliquaries, but heavier, more cumbersome chests containing the most ancient vestments, the Abbey's original royal charters and deeds. And the most precious, irreplaceable illuminated manuscripts from the scriptorium, works that represented centuries of devoted artistry and scholarship. They chose a long disused, partly collapsed undercroft beneath the old, now abandoned, original dormitory, a place even most of the nuns did not know existed. Its entrance, a narrow, low doorway, was cunningly concealed behind a large, seemingly permanent stack of seasoned firewood in a seldom visited storeroom at the furthest end of the West Range. The work was physically demanding, back-breaking for women and used to such heavy labor, and emotionally draining, fraught with constant, heart-stopping anxiety. Every creak of a floorboard under the weight of a chest, every distant shout from Thorne's men patrolling the outer grounds, every rustle in the ivy outside the storeroom window, sent their hearts leaping into their throats. Sister Cecily, who had proven her discretion and possessed a knack for quiet, almost invisible movement, was brought further into their confidence to act as a lookout during these nocturnal activities. Her youthful fear was now overlaid with a fierce, protective loyalty to Agnes and a solemn, almost exhilarating sense of participating in something vital, something secret and profoundly important. One particularly dark and windy night, as they were carefully, agonizingly, lowering a heavy oak chest bound with iron, containing, Agnes knew, the priceless Ashworth Gospels and the Chronicles of Abbess Ejiofor, into the damp, earthy-smelling confines of the undercroft, a loose flagstone in the storeroom floor shifted treacherously under John Fletcher's worn boot. He stumbled, hissing a suppressed oath. and the chest thudded loudly onto the earth below. They froze, every muscle tensed, listening, their breath held tight in their lungs, the silence in the storeroom suddenly absolute, save for the frantic hammering of their own hearts. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approached the storeroom door from the outer cloister. Agnes, reacting with an instinct born of sheer terror, swiftly doused their single, hooded lantern, plunging them into impenetrable blackness. She pushed Fletcher and Eleanor towards the deepest shadows behind the woodpile, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The latch on the storeroom door creaked upwards. A sliver of yellow light from a guard's lantern pierced the darkness, sweeping across the dusty floor. "Anyone in here?" a gruff, suspicious voice called out. "Heard a noise?" "I did." Silence. An eternity of silence, broken only by the sighing of the wind outside and the distant hoot of an owl. The guard grunted, evidently peered around the visible portion of the storeroom. Cursorily, then, apparently satisfied that it was merely rats or the old building settling, closed the door with a thud and his footsteps receded down the cloister. They waited, motionless, for what seemed an age before Agnes dared to relight the lantern, her hand trembling so violently she could barely strike the flint. The flame, when it finally caught, cast flickering, demonic shadows on their pale, sweat-sheened faces. The incident served as a stark, terrifying reminder of the desperate risks they were taking. If discovered, this would be undeniable, irrefutable proof of concealment of monastic assets, a deliberate act of defiance against the king's commissioners. Treason. And the penalty for treason, as all England knew, was a swift journey to the scaffold or the gallows. Master Richard Thorne, meanwhile, as if sensing their covert resistance, their stubborn refusal to crumble under his relentless pressure, seemed to grow colder, his methods more insidious, his patience wearing thin. He began to hint, in his private interviews with Agnes, at the grim fate of other abbots and abbesses who had proven uncooperative. Tales of imprisonment in the Tower of London, of public humiliation and degradation, of ancient and noble estates utterly despoiled and their former inhabitants. Men and women of God, left destitute, to beg or starve on the public highways. He also began, with cynical skill, to exploit any hint of division or discontent he could uncover within the increasingly stressed and fearful community. He offered private, confidential audiences to any nun who wished to speak with him, promising them the king's benevolent favor, a comfortable future in the secular world, and even a small dowry, should they choose to renounce their vows and provide useful information regarding the true state of the abbey's affairs, or the abbess's private actions and intentions. One older nun, Sister Agnes Adeo, a woman known for her fervent, almost ostentatious piety but also for a certain querulousness, a sharp tongue, and a long-held, deeply buried resentment at having been consistently overlooked for the prestigious position of Abbey Chantress, was seen leaving Thorne's office one afternoon looking both profoundly frightened and strangely, almost furtively, purposeful. Abbess Agnes's heart sank when she heard of it from a worried Sister Eleanor. Betrayal from within, from one of their own, was a weapon against which she had few, if any, defenses. The following day, as if on cue, Thorne summoned Abbess Agnes to the chapter house. His expression, when she entered, was one of grim, almost predatory satisfaction. "Reverend Mother," he said, his voice silkily menacing, every word precisely enunciated, "it has come to my attention, through a most reliable and conscientious source whose identity I am not at liberty to disclose, that certain significant irregularities have occurred, and continue to occur, regarding this abbey's declared assets. That, to put the matter in plain English, Reverend Mother, you have sought to deceive the king's duly appointed commissioners by deliberately concealing items of considerable material and, no doubt in your view, spiritual value." Abbess Agnes met his gaze, her mind racing, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Had Sister Agnes Adeo, in her bitterness or her fear, seen something of their nocturnal activities? Or was this merely a bluff, a clever, cruel tactic to frighten her into a damaging confession? Ashworth Abbey has declared all its assets truthfully and fully, Master Thorne, as our meticulously kept ledgers will attest, and as I have consistently maintained. Ledgers, Abbess, can be selective in what they choose to reveal. As, indeed, can memories, especially when prompted by fear of discovery. He leaned forward, his pale eyes boring into hers. I am therefore giving you one final opportunity to be entirely forthcoming. To make a full and unreserved accounting of all properties, treasures, and chattels belonging to this house, whether openly displayed or discreetly stored. Failure to do so, Reverend Mother, will have the gravest possible consequences. For you, personally. And, I assure you, for every soul currently under your charge. He let the unspoken threat hang heavy and poisonous in the air between them. Abbess Agnes felt the net, so carefully woven by Thorne over the past weeks, tightening inexorably around her, around Ashworth, around everything she held dear. The time for subtle maneuvering, for desperate hope against diminishing hope, was rapidly running out. The choices before her were narrowing with every passing hour, each one more terrible, more soul-wrenching, than the last. The accumulated weight of 4 centuries of Ashworth's history, the uncertain fate of 30 vulnerable souls, rested squarely, crushingly, upon her weary shoulders. And the autumn wind, sighing its mournful song through the abbey's ancient, hallowed stones, seemed to whisper insistently of an ending. An inevitable, heartbreaking conclusion. The deadline Thorne had given her, 24 short hours to make a full accounting of all sequestered assets or face the dire consequences of his, and the king's displeasure, hung over Ashworth Abbey like a headsman's axe, poised to fall. Agnes spent much of that long, tormented night in the cold, echoing silence of the great church, kneeling ramrod straight on the unforgiving stone flags before the high altar. The single sanctuary lamp, its flames symbolizing the ever-present Christ, cast long, dancing, almost demonic shadows that seemed to writhe like tormented spirits on the ancient, unadorned stone walls. Her prayers were no longer eloquent pleas for deliverance, or even for guidance. They were a raw, almost wordless outpouring of her soul's anguish, a desperate appeal for clarity, for the moral and physical strength to do what was right. Or at least what was least wrong, however bitter the cost, however devastating the outcome. She thought of her sacred vows, sworn so solemnly all those years ago: poverty, chastity, obedience. Obedience to God, certainly, that was the bedrock of her existence. But what of obedience to a temporal king who now styled himself God's supreme vicar on earth, yet whose actions seemed deliberately designed to dismantle God's own houses? To scatter his dedicated servants, to seize his consecrated treasures for worldly purposes, where did true obedience lie in such a treacherous, morally ambiguous landscape? She thought of her community, her sisters in Christ, the older nuns, like Perpetua and Bridget, for whom Ashworth was the only home they had known for half a century or more, their frail bodies and gentle souls ill-equipped for the harshness of a suddenly hostile world. The younger ones, like Sister Cecily, whose innocent, blossoming faith was now confronted with the brutal realities of state power and human greed. Could she, in good conscience, lead them into almost certain destitution and persecution for the sake of an abstract principle? For a defiant gesture that, however noble, would ultimately prove futile against the might of the crown. But then, her mind, tormented and restless, turned to the legacy of Ashworth itself, the centuries of unbroken prayer that had sanctified these walls, the tradition of scholarship that had produced such exquisite manuscripts, the acts of charity that had sustained the local poor through famine and plague. She pictured the magnificent Psalter Cecily was so painstakingly illuminating, its vellum pages alive with burnished gold leaf and precious lapis lazuli, each stroke a prayer. A testament to God's glory. She recalled the ancient royal charters, granting Ashworth its lands and liberties, signed by kings long dead and turned to dust, parchments that represented a sacred trust she had sworn to uphold. To surrender these willingly, to sign them away with her own hand, felt like an egregious betrayal of every abbess who had come before her, a negation of her entire life's purpose. Towards the false dawn, as the first faint, pearlescent gray light began to creep through the tall, lancet windows of the East End, a fragile, exhausted peace settled upon her. The agonizing path forward was no clearer than it had been at dusk, but the violent turmoil in her heart had subsided, replaced by a weary, almost numb resignation, and beneath that, a hard, unshakable core of resolve. She would face Master Thorne. She would speak her truth, as God gave her grace to speak it. And she would accept the consequences, trusting in God's ultimate mercy, if not in the king's. Sister Eleanor, her face etched with worry and lack of sleep, found her there as the first true light of morning, cold and unforgiving, illuminated the dust motes dancing in the chancel. The sub-prioress looked as though she had not slept at all. "Agnes," she whispered, her usual brusqueness entirely softened by a deep, compassionate concern. Have you decided what must be done?" Agnes rose from her knees, her limbs stiff and aching from the long vigil on the cold stones. "I have decided, Eleanor," she said, her voice quiet but surprisingly firm, "that I will not be bullied or tricked into a lie. Nor will I willingly sign away what is not truly mine to give, what has been consecrated to God for all time." A shadow of despair crossed Eleanor's strong features. "But the nuns, Agnes. Their safety. Their very lives, perhaps." "Their safety is paramount in my thoughts, believe me," Agnes replied, her gaze meeting Eleanor's steadily. "But so, too, is their spirit, their immortal souls. To what future would I condemn them if I, their abbess, teach them by my own example that faith and integrity can be bought and sold for a false promise of temporal security, that our sacred vows are mere trifles to be discarded when threatened by worldly power?" She placed a trembling but resolute hand on Eleanor's arm. "Whatever happens today, Eleanor, we will face it together, you and I, and all our sisters. As we have always faced every trial, with God's help." When Master Richard Thorne summoned her later that morning, his messenger curt and impatient, Abbess Agnes walked to the chapter house with a steady step, her head held high. He was seated, as before, at the great oak table, a freshly penned document spread out before him. The deed of surrender. His clerk, riotously, stood beside him, a look of nervous, self-important gravity on his thin face. "Well, Abbess," Thorne's voice was clipped, devoid of any pretense of courtesy now. "Have you come to your senses? Are you prepared to make a full confession of your deceptions and throw yourself and your disobedient house entirely upon the king's most gracious mercy by signing this instrument of surrender?" He gestured with an imperious flick of his wrist towards the damning document. Agnes looked at the deed, its formal, legalistic Latin phrases blurring for a moment before her eyes. It spoke of Ashworth Abbey, through its Abbess Agnes, freely and willingly. And with the unanimous consent of the community, surrendering all its lands, properties, possessions, rights, and hereditaments, both spiritual and temporal, into the king's most noble and puissant hands, for him to dispose of as he saw fit, freely, willingly. Unanimous consent. The words were a grotesque mockery of the truth, a calculated legal fiction designed to legitimize an act of naked appropriation. "Master Thorne," she began, her voice quiet but carrying a surprising firmness that seemed to fill the cold, austere room, "I have, throughout this arduous visitation, answered all your questions truthfully, to the best of my ability and knowledge. Ashworth Abbey, as I have repeatedly stated, has served God and, in all lawful matters, the Crown, faithfully and diligently for 400 years. We have sheltered the needy. educated the ignorant where we could, nursed the sick, and prayed daily for the souls of all Christian folk, including His Majesty the King. Our only deception, if such it be in your eyes, Master Thorn, was to attempt, in our fear and our love for this sacred place, to preserve some small part of that holy heritage from what we profoundly feared would be its imminent desecration and dispersal at worldly hands. Thorn's pale eyes narrowed to icy slits. So you admit to the deliberate concealment of monastic assets, Abbess, in direct contravention of the King's commission and my explicit instructions. I admit to being the sworn custodian of treasures dedicated solely to the glory and service of Almighty God. Master Thorn, Agnes countered, her chin lifting almost imperceptibly. And to fearing, with good cause, it now seems, that men who serve a worldly king, however powerful, might not fully appreciate their spiritual value, or treat them with the reverence they deserve. The king appreciates their monetary value, Abbess, I assure you of that, Thorn said with a thin, cold smile that held no warmth, only a chilling satisfaction. And your open admission of willful concealment constitutes a grave act of defiance. Treason, some more zealous prosecutors than I might well call it. He pushed the deed of surrender across the polished table towards her, along with an inkhorn and a freshly sharpened quill. Sign it. It is your only remaining path to any form of clemency, however undeserved. A small pension for yourself and your nuns, as stipulated. A peaceful, if ignominious, dispersal. Refuse. And you will find that the king's mercy, so often proclaimed, has its very definite limits. You will be attainted. Your nuns cast out with nothing but the rags on their backs, and this abbey stripped bare by force, its every stone a testament to your folly and obstinacy. The choice, Abbess, is yours. But make it now. My patience, unlike yours, is not inexhaustible. The room was utterly silent save for the faint, nervous scratching of Wriothesley's quill as he ostensibly took notes of the proceedings, and the heavy, rhythmic beat of Agnes's own heart, which felt as though it might burst from her chest. This was the precipice, the final, agonizing moment of decision. She looked at Thorn, at his cold, implacable face. A face devoid of pity or human understanding. She thought of her nuns, of their terrified, trusting faces. She thought of the hidden manuscripts, the sacred chalices. Were they worth the utter ruin, the potential starvation or persecution of so many innocent lives? A memory, unbidden, surfaced in her mind's eye, her own solemn investiture as Abbess of Ashworth, a decade ago, in this very chapter house. The crushing weight of the ancient silver ring on her finger, the bishop's solemn, resonant charge, shepherd your flock with wisdom and with courage. Defend the faith against all adversity. Preserve this house and its sacred traditions for generations yet to come. Wisdom. Courage. Preservation. Sometimes, Agnes realized with a sudden, painful, illuminating clarity that pierced through her fear and her anguish, those cherished virtues pulled in starkly opposing directions. Sometimes, the greatest courage lay not in proud, unyielding defiance, however righteous, but in a humble, heartbreaking sacrifice that felt, in the moment, like an utter, abject defeat. Sometimes, true preservation meant not saving the ancient stones, however hallowed, or the precious gold, however beautiful, but the living, breathing, vulnerable souls. She reached out a steady hand and took the quill Thorn offered. The rough feather felt alien, almost profane, in her fingers, so accustomed to the smooth vellum of her prayer book, the polished wood of her rosary. If I sign this document, Master Thorn, she said, her voice low and steady, each word carefully weighed, what absolute assurances do I have for the future welfare of my sisters? That the pensions promised, however meager, will indeed be paid promptly and without deduction. That they will not be molested, or falsely accused, or left to starve on the public roads once they are beyond these walls. Thorn looked visibly surprised by her question, by her sudden shift from defiance to negotiation. Then, a flicker of something akin to smug triumph crossed his sharp features. He had won. He had broken her. "You have the king's most royal word, Abbess," he said smoothly, "conveyed through me, his humble servant. The pensions will be honored, as stipulated in the deed, provided, of course, that your surrender is complete, unreserved, and fully cooperative in all subsequent matters." Agnes held his gaze, searching for any hint of sincerity, any sliver of compassion, but found none. "And the sacred vessels, Master Thorn, the ancient books from our library that we sought only to protect from harm, they will be treated with the respect due to their history and their artistry, not wantonly destroyed as mere spoils of war, or melted down for their base metal." Thorn hesitated for a fraction of a second. "They become, by this deed, the king's property, Abbess, to dispose of as his majesty, in his wisdom, sees fit. But I will, of course, note your particular concern in my report to the Vicar General." A typically evasive, non-committal answer, as she had fully expected. It was as much as she could hope for. She dipped the quill into the inkhorn. For one long, suspended moment, she paused, her eyes closed in a silent, desperate prayer for forgiveness, for strength, for a sign that she was not utterly damning her own soul. Then, with a firm, unwavering hand, Abbess Agnes of Ashworth, custodian of 4 centuries of faith and tradition, signed her name to the deed of surrender, the elegant, practiced script, a stark, black testament to the ending of an era, the death of a dream. As she laid down the quill, a profound, bone-deep weariness settled over her, a weariness that seemed to penetrate to the very core of her being. Yet, paradoxically, with it came a strange, unexpected sense of release, of a burden finally, however painfully, laid down. She had made her choice. She had chosen her nun's immediate, precarious safety over the abbey's material and perhaps even its spiritual legacy, as the world would measure it. Whether it was the right choice, the best choice, only God, in his infinite wisdom and mercy, could truly judge. Thorn took the signed document from her, his expression one of cool, professional satisfaction. He scanned her signature, then nodded curtly to Riothusly, who quickly sprinkled sand upon the wet ink. "Wisely done, Abbess. You have saved yourself, and your sisters, much unnecessary unpleasantness." He stood, a signal that the audience was over. "My men will begin the formal process of taking inventory and securing the premises on behalf of the Crown immediately. You and your nuns will be required to vacate Ashworth Abbey within 3 days. See to it that there is no further trouble, no further attempts at concealment. It would not go well for you. 3 days. 72 short hours. To dismantle 4 centuries of history, of community, of consecrated life. To say farewell to the only true home many of them had ever known." The final service in Ashworth Abbey's great, now strangely barren, church was held on the evening of the 2nd day, as the chill autumn dusk gathered like a shroud in the high vaulted roof. The nave was stripped bare. The ancient tapestries, the statues of saints, even the heavy silver candlesticks from the high altar, had already been unceremoniously removed by Thorn's men, catalogued with brisk efficiency by Riothusly, and crated for transport to the king's insatiable treasury in London. Only the great stone altar itself remained, stark and unadorned, and before it, the single, bravely flickering sanctuary lamp that Agnes herself had kept lit, a tiny beacon of defiance in the encroaching darkness. The nuns' voices, usually so clear and resonant in their unaccompanied plainsong, were fragile now, hesitant, freighted with unshed tears and unspoken griefs. Agnes, officiating for the last time in this sacred space, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her breast, spoke the ancient, timeless Latin words of the Vespers, her own voice thick with an emotion she struggled to control. As she gave the final blessing, her gaze swept slowly, lovingly, over their pale, upturned faces. Eleanor, her strong, usually stoic features etched with a profound sorrow. Young Sister Cecily, her shoulders shaking with silent, unrestrained weeping. Even Sister Mary Magdalene, her worldly cynicism for once entirely subdued by the solemnity and heartbreak of the moment. These were her flock, her beloved sisters. For them, for their fragile future, she had made this terrible sacrifice. The next morning, under a cold, relentlessly grey sky that threatened a miserable, soaking rain, the 30 nuns of Ashworth Abbey departed from their home. Each carried a small, pitiful bundle of personal belongings, a spare habit, a prayer book, perhaps a treasured rosary. The promised pensions were indeed small, barely enough to sustain them for a few months, and their futures were shrouded in uncertainty. Some, the younger ones with families still living, would return to a secular world they barely knew, a world that might not welcome them. Others, older and without connections, like Sister Perpetua, faced a grim, terrifying prospect. John Fletcher, his weathered face a mask of helpless grief, had used his local contacts to arrange temporary, crowded lodging for a few of them in the nearby village. But it was a precarious, temporary reprieve at best. Abbess Agnes was the last to leave. She stood for a long moment at the great, now unguarded, gatehouse, looking back at the silent, empty shell of the abbey. Thorne's men were already swarming over it like ants, their voices loud and jarringly cheerful in the once sacred stillness. A thin plume of acrid smoke rose from the direction of the cloister garth. They were burning books from the library. No doubt, deemed superstitious or popish by the ignorant, zealous reformers. A part of her heart, the part that cherished learning and beauty, seemed to shrivel and die at the sight. She clutched the small, worn leather satchel at her side. In it, wrapped carefully in a piece of altar linen she had managed to save, were 2 items, all that remained of Ashworth's tangible heritage that she could carry. A small, exquisitely illuminated book of hours, one of the scriptorium's earliest and most beautiful treasures, which she had hidden even from Eleanor. And her own predecessor's simple silver. Abbess's ring, which she had slipped from her finger and replaced with a plain wooden one before signing the deed. Small tokens, perhaps, almost insignificant against the magnitude of what was lost. But they were something. A spark of memory, of continuity. As she turned her back on Ashworth for the last time and walked slowly away, joining the small, forlorn group of her sisters huddled on the muddy track that led towards the village and an unknown future, the first drops of cold autumn rain began to fall, mingling with the silent tears that traced a path down her own pale cheeks. 1 year later, in a small, damp, 2-roomed cottage on the impoverished outskirts of a minor market town some 20 hard miles from the now despoiled and rapidly decaying ruins of Ashworth Abbey, Mistress Agnes, as she was now known in the secular world, sat by a sputtering, smoky fire, trying to coax a little warmth into her chilled fingers. With her were Sister Eleanor, whose indomitable pragmatic spirit and surprising skill at bargaining for scarce food had proven invaluable in navigating their new, harsh reality, and young Sister Cecily, whose delicate artistic talents were now employed in mending torn linen for a pittance from the local innkeeper's wife. 3 other older nuns, the most frail of their surviving community, shared the cramped, impoverished dwelling, their days spent mostly in prayer and whatever small, repetitive tasks their failing strength and dimming eyesight still allowed. Life was unutterably hard. The promised royal pensions were irregular, often months in arrears, and frequently reduced by corrupt local officials. But they survived, somehow. Agnes, with a pain that never truly lessened, had been forced, through John Fletcher's discreet and sorrowful help before his own death from a winter fever some months past, to sell a few of the beautifully illuminated vellum pages from the precious Book of Hours, a desperate painful necessity, to buy them food, firewood, and medicine for Sister Bridget's persistent cough. But it was not all despair, not entirely. In the precious, fleeting hours of daylight, when the rain held off, and in the evenings, by the flickering, uncertain light of a single, carefully hoarded tallow candle, Agnes would take out the remaining pages of the Book of Hours. And she would teach. She taught Cecily, whose eyes still held a spark of her former artistic brightness, and the other younger women from the town who sought her out, curious, intelligent daughters of local yeomen or impoverished tradesmen, eager for a learning denied them elsewhere, to read, to write, to understand the elegant Latin phrases, to appreciate the delicate artistry of the ancient illuminations, to glimpse a world beyond their own narrow, circumscribed lives. The grand, echoing scriptorium of Ashworth Abbey was gone forever. Its magnificent library was scattered to the winds, its contents lost, burned, or mouldering in forgotten chests. But here, in this humble, crowded cottage, warmed by a meager fire and a shared sense of purpose, a small, fragile flame of learning, of beauty, of unwavering faith, still flickered determinately against the encroaching darkness. It was not the grand, enduring legacy Agnes had once envisioned for Ashworth, not the triumphant continuation of centuries of unbroken tradition. But as she looked at the eager young faces bent earnestly over the ancient, precious parchment, their minds slowly awakening to the power and wonder of words and ideas, she knew, with a quiet, unshakable certainty, that it was a legacy nonetheless. The stones had been taken, the gold seized, the powerful institution dissolved by royal decree. But the spirit, she had learned through bitter trial and profound loss, was a harder, more resilient thing to extinguish. It endured, passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart, a quiet, persistent act of defiance and hope in a world that had tried, and spectacularly failed, to crush it entirely.